Hey, Mama. Welcome to Marketing Without Socials for Moms, the go-to podcast for moms in business who want to stop relying on social media to build their business and build it in a way that fits their current season of life. I'm your host, Andria Singletary, a wife, mama of two, and visibility strategist for moms. Each week, I'm giving you the inside scoop on how to increase your visibility, leads, and sales through podcasting, email marketing, and collaborations. Ready to truly make social media optional in your business? Grab your chai tea latte and let's dive into today's episode. Your podcast name is one of the most important aspects of your podcast, and there are some things you should seriously consider before choosing a name and launching your podcast. Now, if you've already launched your podcast, still listen because this can help you in making any necessary changes to your podcast name. But when it comes to naming your podcast, it is honestly one of the hardest aspects of podcasting. This is usually one of the most challenging parts my podcast launch clients face. They'll have ideas for names, but the name doesn't always, work in their favor from a searchability and discoverability aspect. The reality is that you want clear over cute. It's so important when choosing a good podcast name. So I'm going to be sharing with you 3 things to consider when naming your podcast. Again, if you've already launched your podcast, you've already named your podcast, still listen. I rebranded my podcast last year. Although, my brand is still Mama Turned Mompreneur, I really was leaning more into, being that person that helps moms with building a business that's social media optional and marketing their business without socials. And so to come in alignment with that and really, hone in on that searchability aspect, really leveraging SEO, I rebranded to Marketing Without Socials for Moms, and it has been the best decision, hands down. Okay, so let's get into the 3 things to consider when naming your podcast. The first thing is that you need to think about podcast SEO and choosing a name that is searchable. Your podcast name needs to include keywords that your ideal listener is searching. The podcast listening apps are searchable. If you type in Marketing Without Social Media in say Apple Podcasts, my podcast comes up as one of the top searches. And I know that those are keywords that my ideal listener is searching. So you really want to be thinking about that, looking at, either if you're in the launching aspect, thinking about the name that you have decided on for your podcast, or if you've already launched your podcast, is that name really searchable? Are those words keywords that your ideal person is searching when they're looking for content specific to the content you create? When they're looking for that, are those the keywords that they're searching? And if they're not, then it's time to look at changing the name. Now, next month, I'm going to be hosting a week-long podcast to clients mini mind, and we will be diving into all things podcast strategy, including podcast SEO and auditing your podcast name for searchability. So head on over to mamaturnedmompreneur.com/mini mind to learn more. But we will be diving into all of this, really choosing the right keywords for your name. And you want to choose the right keywords because it does connect to your podcast growth. If you have a podcast name that's not searchable, your ideal listeners aren't going to be able to find you. And so that's when you see that stagnant growth. Now, of course, there's other strategies too to grow your podcast, but your podcast name, that's one of the top things right there. If you have a very searchable name, that's going to work in your favor. That's going to make sure that the right people are finding your podcast. The other thing that goes with this aspect of choosing a podcast name, don't use the word the or any article for that matter as the first word of your podcast name. So the, a, and even like certain pronouns like your, that type of thing, that is not helpful in that first word is prime real estate for keywords. Like you want that first word of your podcast name to be a highly searchable word. Now, if you are like really adamant, like I want the word the, you can include it on your cover art. But when you actually input your name in like your podcast hosting platform, don't include the word the. Again, it takes up prime real estate for keywords, for searchability, for SEO and everything. So that's the first thing. The next thing is that you want to choose a podcast name that's super clear on what the podcast is about and who the podcast is for. People should be able to tell from the name of your podcast instantly whether or not the podcast is for them. Again, this is why I love that I did my rebrand. I've been sharing about my podcast more on threads, especially just coming across different threads where people are asking for podcast recommendations. So people who are asking for podcasts that are geared towards moms and business owners, people who are asking for podcasts that talk about, different marketing strategies outside of social media. And my name is super clear, Marketing Without Socials for Moms. You instantly know what you're going to get from my podcast. It's super clear. There's no confusion there. But my old name, Mama Turned Mompreneur, okay, yeah, it's geared towards moms, but in what aspect? Okay, business strategies, but can you be more specific? So you want to choose a name where people can tell, like they know, okay, this is the podcast I've been looking for. Now you can also add a tagline, and I do recommend, having a tagline on your cover art to kind of further communicate what the podcast is about. But like just at initial glance, you want people to be able to tell from your podcast name what that podcast is about and who it's for. And then the last thing you want to consider is the availability of the name. I see this all the time. People don't check to see if that name is actually available. And so you want to look at, okay, is somebody already using that podcast name? Does somebody have that name as their website domain? So do your homework before choosing a name. I have seen it so many times where I've gone to search for a podcast and about 3 or 4 different podcasts with the same name come up. And that's frustrating, right? Like, sure, people know your name and everything, and they may be like, okay, well, I want to listen to the podcast by so and so, but it's just frustrating. Like, especially if it's somebody new who doesn't know who you are, they're looking for a podcast on this specific topic, but then here's these 3 or 4 podcasts with that same name. And so they may not even end up listening to your podcast. The other thing is that if you're using a name that's already in use and it's trademark, you're going to get that cease and desist letter. And then you're going to have to go through the process of changing everything after you've already launched the podcast. That is going to be frustrating. And so you don't want to have to go through all of that. Not to say that you won't ever rebrand, because like I said, I rebranded my podcast last year. But if you can avoid that, if you can do your homework ahead of time and just check to make sure it is available, do your due diligence, make it easier on yourself. So, as a recap, when it comes to choosing a good podcast name, you want to choose a name that is keyword friendly and searchable. It's super clear on who the podcast is for and what it's about, and it's available, meaning you are the only person using that podcast name. Now, if you're looking for more support with podcast strategy as a mom in business, join us next month for the week-long Podcast to Clients mini mind, where I'll be supporting a group of 5 women with turning their podcast into the ultimate lead generation and marketing asset for their business. During the week of the Mini Mind, we will be diving into strategies for growing your podcast audience with the right listeners, selling in your podcast content, planning strategic podcast content, podcast SEO, and so much more. Like, I am not holding back. You guys are going to learn so much from me, but also you're going to get my eyes on your podcast. You're going to be able to submit things for direct feedback, whether that's, your podcast outlines or auditing different aspects of your podcast and everything. It's going to be so good. So if you have a podcast and you've been looking to work with me in this capacity, this is the offer for you. Head on over to mamaturnedmompreneur.com/minimind to learn more and grab your spot today. All right, Mama, I'll catch you in the next episode. Hey, Mama. Thank you so much for taking time out of your busy day to hang with me. I would love to keep the conversation going. So head to mamaturnedmompreneur.com/marketing without socials to join my email community. I share even more tips and strategies for building a business that doesn't rely on social media and one that fits your current season of life, as well as more behind the scenes of mom and business life. All right, Mama, that's it for today, but I'll catch up with you again next week.